So we've got something a little bit different on the bench today. This is actually an emergency light. Like if you'll see in a lot of different vehicles, the blue lights and stuff that are actually inside of a vehicle, not like the big light bars on top like the police tend to use and on top of fire trucks. Um, these are more tending towards personally owned vehicles. For those of you that don't know, I am in the volunteer fire department here locally, and many of the departments around where I am do allow you to use emergency lights in your own personal vehicle for responding to calls. We do have rules and regulations in place and things like that. So, a lot of places don't allow it, but for my department and most of the others around me, we do. So I was actually giving this light to a friend of mine, and he plugged it in, and I haven't used this for probably close to 3 years now. And before that, it's probably almost 10 years old. So, anyways, I gave it to him, and he went and plugged it in, and he said that the white lights aren't working. Now, this particular setup uses 2 reds and 2 whites. I do think we could actually go in there if we wanted to and change them around, but I like having the reds on one side, the whites on the other, and we're not going to go that deep into it. We're going to try to fix the issue that it's having. Now, I don't know how this is going to show up on camera, but we're going to try to output this and see what it looks like. I don't think that's too bad. Now the whites, if the whites were working, they would be a lot brighter. It may kind of play some camera tricks, but you can see how the reds are blinking. The whites are kind of supposed to be in tandem with that, if I remember the pattern correctly, is that when this red is lit up, this white is synchronized with it, and vice versa. So obviously we see that the whites aren't working, and they actually are working just a little bit. Let me see if I can get it to pick up if we blind ourselves to these reds a little. It is just barely, you might be able to see, picking up a little bit of a white. So we'll get this light pulled apart, and I suspect that this will be a case of bad capacitors, but we never know. So let's get into this thing. Alright, so if I remember right, this wire here, this little red one, I believe you actually pull that high or low, and you can change the pattern on it. We're not really interested in that. And the board itself looks very cheaply constructed. All right, hang on. Just got to get a couple of little bolts off of here to get this cover. Alright, so we can see here a pair of electrolytics. These look like they're just going to be some little voltage regulators. This may be a reference. Looks like that is going to be some sort of just a little diode. This is more than likely going to be our actual driver that tells things when to happen, and just some kind of surrounding circuitry. So I'm automatically going to suspect these 2 electrolytics. Actually, I'm just going to suspect the one, but I don't really know which one might be bad, so we're going to go ahead and just desolder them both. I think I do have the components to replace them, so I think the best thing to do is just to replace those 2 electrolytics and see what happens. Kind of suck if it's all that simple though, wouldn't it? We might have something a little bit more in depth in there, but we'll see. Alright, so I figured before we just go and replace those caps, now would be a good time to actually put the 4-channel scope to use. And so I've hooked up the driver. I've unhooked the LEDs and hooked the driver up to the 4 channels. And it's not the best thing in the world, but we can see some stuff happening. Let me pan, what is it, pan or is it tilt? Let me tilt y'all down real quick. so we can look at kind of how I've got it set up. Okay, so here's the driver that we looked at earlier, and you can see my scope probes down here, and you can see on these connections what I actually ended up having to do was I put some 68 kilo ohm resistors in there across the connection, just to give it some sort of load. Without the load, it was just really, it gave a really weird waveform that I'll show y'all in a second. But just know that, like, for a lot of these things, whenever you're probing them, it does need some sort of load to be able to regulate properly. Okay, so whenever I actually got this thing to where it was showing me the waves like I wanted to, it wasn't exactly what I expected. I'll tell you what, let me turn off a couple of the channels just to kind of clean it up for a minute. There we go, that looks much better. I'm at 5 volts per division right now, and I can see, here's my ground here. I'm pretty much ignoring this little bit of oscillation I've got happening at the bottom. But these upper pulses are the LED on times. So we can see that we are getting some blinking here. And it is actually coming up to 12 volts, which the 68K, I thought that was actually kind of low. Maybe it's a little high, but I figured that would be a good load to show, you know, some kind of shorting or something, you know, some kind of an issue, you know, at least on the 2 channels that aren't working. Okay, so that's close enough. But you can see this is our ground here for all 4 channels, and all 4 waveforms are exactly identical. So first of all, I actually expected 2 of the channels to be alternating, because remember, we have some lights on and they blink a few times, and then the other set goes on and blinks a few times. So this was kind of odd to me, but I think that what's happening here is that there's just the way that the signal is actually happening and the way that the scope is reading it is that it's kind of overlapping each one, which that's fine. I don't really care about that. But I really did expect 2 of the channels to be much lower than the other ones, since we were barely getting any light out of those LEDs. So this didn't help me as much as I thought it would. I thought it'd be really cool. We'd be able to actually see the issue in the waveforms. It is still cool to be able to probe this thing and see what all 4 channels are doing at once. But as far as helping us troubleshoot, it doesn't really. Okay, so let's go ahead and unload one of these circuits. It's going to be a little tricky, so let me reprobe it. Oh, hang on, we're shorting out. Okay, so we can see that we just opened one of those circuits, and we're going to put this scope probe straight on there. And which channel is this? Channel 4. Let's go ahead and pull channel 4 down. Oh wow, the waveform's exactly the same. Let's unload its corresponding, this little buddy, which should be you. So I've actually went and unloaded all of the circuits, and really, other than channel 2 here, which is actually not probing at all anymore, it didn't change the waveforms, and it did earlier. I promise it did early. It did change it earlier. So I'm wondering if we're just not getting an intermittent fault. You know, maybe the capacitors cooled off a little bit and need to warm up again, or maybe they warmed up and need to cool off. But it's very strange. I was getting a really weird sort of almost sinusoidal waveform on here earlier. That's really strange. So I guess before I do anything, let me go ahead and just change those capacitors and see what happens. Alright, so I think at this point, rather than just kind of going around blind on this board, we'll throw a couple parts at it. We'll change out these two electrolytic caps, which are going to be my first suspects, and pretty much hope for the best there. Now I do have the exact replacements. These are from the Tektronix scope repair. I did order some extras, so I'm glad I did that. It won't take but a couple of minutes to change these out, and we'll be able to see if that's the problem or not. Alright, so I've replaced those two SMD caps, and I did actually check the two old ones with the ESR meter, and one of them tested about 0.7 ohms, 75 ohms, something like that, which is probably okay. I feel like it's kind of high, but this one actually tested 0.15K. In fact, I couldn't even test it on my regular ESR meter. It would actually read overload, but I use this little multifunction tester, which is actually a really handy little deal. I think I picked this up for like 17 bucks on eBay, and it actually was able to tell me that it was such a high ESR. So tested it out. It seems to be working fine. Now, I did figure out why the scope was reading everything synchronized. It was because I had inadvertently went somewheres along the lines and actually reset the system. Well, guys, looks like we just screwed ourselves. I blew up a voltage regulator. Yay. At least I think that's what that is. Well, god dog it. Okay, so what happened there was mostly my fault, actually. I did actually have this connector pulled apart and just stabbed in there, and it shorted out. But I also didn't realize that I was actually in the incorrect memory setting for my power supply. And I have my number one memory I actually have set at like 12.12 volts and like 0.25 amps. But every other setting is still default. And the default settings are the full output of the power supply. So we had 32 volts, 3 amps power available to us on this light. The 32 volts, I mean, obviously it was dealing with it, so that seemed okay. But the 3 amp setting, I think it's actually like 3.2, whenever this connector actually shorted itself, all of that power went through a little in-channel MOSFET and just, I mean, fried it. So luckily I actually did have another light that didn't work that had 2 of those in-channel MOSFETs. So I got that replaced, and it seems to be working fine. Let me just be very careful with it. You can see it is actually a lot brighter now. That 0.25 amps was just not enough to push this. You can see now it's sitting comfortably around an amp, which is kind of what we actually want coming from here. But everything is working good except for these 2 individual LEDs here. Now that's nothing from the controller itself. That is actually going to be inside of this LED module. So our next step is to pull this module apart. I actually remove this module and see, it looks like those LEDs are really dim. It's kind of hard to tell because of the diffuser. They may actually be off, but we'll see if we can't actually get these 2 LEDs working. Okay, so here's that little light module. You can see there's not much on it. On the back, we have a little heat sink that's actually just kind of loose in there, and a little layer of like thermal material inside of that. And component wise, we have the LEDs, of course. We've got our current limiting resistors for the LEDs. And we have what I believe is a little voltage regulator. I'll have to find that component number and look it up. But you can see obviously here, if you look, these are these two LEDs that are bad. And you can see these two, which are good. You can see that there's just that little yellow kind of element part in there. It's not really an element, I don't know what you would call it. And you can see that these are just brown. So they aren't working at all. I don't think that I have any, definitely don't have these kind of LEDs. I don't think I have any white LEDs at all. I'll take a look, but if I don't have any, then I don't think I'm going to replace these, and it'll just, kind of, it is what it is. They'll have two lights that aren't working for them. So, really simple little module, but unfortunately I don't have spare parts for it. Alright, so I got the light bulb put all back together. I actually took this module and turned it around to where the two out LEDs were in the kind of bottom corner, because that's the least conspicuous area, at least to me. And you can see that it doesn't look bad at all. You know, maybe later on I'll go ahead and try to locate some of those LEDs and go ahead and replace them. But honestly, I think this is good enough. I mean, like I said, the light bulb is 10 years old. Those new caps are probably going to have it good for another 10 years. So I like it. My buddy likes it. He came and picked his pattern out, which I think is maybe a random. I think maybe not. I don't remember. But that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit, and thanks for watching.